the giant bride who waited years for her husband's return. Witness this unbelievable, true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The wind rolled low across the valley, warm and heavy, with the scent of sage and summer rain. Out beyond the border town of Silver Hollow, the prairie stretched until it broke against a ring of copper mountains. There was nothing out there now but wild grass, a few half-fallen fences, and one old cabin crouched beside the river. If you were to ride that way, you might think it empty, until you saw the shape standing near the ridge, still as a monument, eyes on the horizon. That was Edda Mae Hart, known once as the giant bride of the West. Some said she was 7 feet tall. Others swore it was nearer 8. The truth sat somewhere between myth and memory. But every old-timer in the territory agreed on one thing. She never left that ridge after her husband rode away to war. Back before the war split the country, Silver Hollow had been a rough but living place. A mix of cowhands, drifters, and railmen chasing new work. Edda was a wonder among them. She wasn't just tall. She carried herself like the earth had shaped her on purpose. Her hands could lift a wagon wheel, but her voice was soft as creek water. When she laughed, men in the saloon fell silent without knowing why. Samuel Hart first saw her at a county dance, summer of '63. He was no taller than her shoulder, a wiry rancher's son with dust-colored hair and a heart that burned hotter than the forge. Most men looked at Edda with fear or curiosity. Samuel looked at her like he was seeing sunrise. They danced once that night, awkward at first, then easy. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like she was afraid to crush him. He grinned up at her and said, "If you step on me, at least I'll die proud." She laughed so hard she cried, and before the season turned, they were married under a sycamore tree beside the river. Folks talked, of course. They said no woman that size could belong among men. Some whispered she came down from the high country, where storms bred giants. Others said she was cursed, a creature of the old world. But when Samuel built their cabin with his own hands, and Edda helped raise its beams as if they were sticks, the talk faded into quiet respect. For 2 years, they lived like something out of a folk song. He'd break horses and trade cattle. She'd keep the hearth burning and sing old mountain hymns that made the windows shake. At night, when the moon climbed over the plains, they'd dance in the open field. From miles away, riders could see them, his small frame and her tall shadow turning slow circles in the silver light. Then came the letter from the Union camp near Fort Bowie. The war had dragged west, pulling every able man into its teeth. Samuel tried to hide the summons, but Edda found it folded beneath his pillow. She said nothing that night, only held him until dawn. When he finally rode out, he promised her he'd be gone just 1 season. "You'll see me before the snow," he said, pressing her hand to his chest. "Keep the fire going. I'll find it." She nodded once, though her eyes carried a storm that words couldn't calm. That winter was long and cruel. The snows came early, sealing the passes. No letters reached Silver Hollow. By spring, widows filled the town. Yet Edda refused to mourn. Every sunrise she walked to the ridge and watched the road until the sun fell again. She kept his boots by the door and his coffee cup on the shelf. When neighbors tried to console her, she'd smile and say he promised he'd come home. Promises don't die. Years began to fold over one another. The war ended. Soldiers limped back in broken lines. Samuel wasn't among them. The government printed lists of the lost, but his name sat between the missing and the presumed. Still she waited. Men came and went. Railroad crews, traders, drifters, chasing silver in the hills. They all saw her at dusk, tall against the horizon, hair the color of storm clouds. Some thought she was a ghost guarding the valley. Others said she was cursed to stone if she left her post. But a few old cowhands, the ones who'd known Samuel, tipped their hats when they passed and muttered that there's love truer than blood. As decades wore down the world, Silver Hollow began to fade. The mine ran dry. The saloon shut its doors. By the 1890s, only a handful of families remained, yet smoke still rose from Edda's chimney. She grew slower, her frame heavy with age, but her eyes never turned from that road. Children born long after the war used to sneak to her cabin for stories. She'd feed them cornbread and tell them how the stars guided travelers when maps failed. "The sky don't lie," she'd say, looking out the window, "and neither do hearts that wait." One summer evening, a traveling photographer came through town. He'd heard whispers of a giant woman who hadn't aged since the war. He rode out with his camera and found her sitting by the river mending a torn saddle. She looked up, polite but wary. "Ma'am," he said, "folks back east would pay to see a sight like you." Edda smiled faintly. "I ain't a sight, son. I'm a story, and stories don't leave their endings half-written." He left without a picture. That autumn brought the longest drought the valley had known. The river shrank to a trickle, the grass turned to dust, and still Edda's lamp burned each night. Sometimes travelers would glimpse her through the heat haze, tall and still, a shimmer of hope against the dying plain. One of those travelers was Deputy Abel Crane, riding circuit from Santa Fe. He stopped at her cabin for water and found her sitting by the hearth, her hands folded over Samuel's old rifle. The weapon was rusted, the stock cracked with age. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if the man you wait for served in the war, that was near 40 years ago. Ain't likely he's still out there." Edda looked up, her grey eyes steady. "Ain't about likely, Deputy. It's about love. Love don't bend to time," he wanted to argue, but the way she said it, quiet and absolute, stopped him cold. He tipped his hat and rode on. Years later, he'd tell his grandkids about her, swearing she hadn't aged a day since that visit. Time in Silver Hollow moved like molasses. By the turn of the century, no one remembered who built the first church or where the post office had stood. But everyone remembered Edda Mae Hart. Children grew up hearing the story before they could ride. On storm nights, when thunder rolled across the prairie, they'd whisper that it was her voice calling his name. The few who dared approach her ridge after dark claimed strange things. A glow near her cabin, footprints larger than any man's, music that came from nowhere. One rancher swore he saw two shadows dancing on the riverbank, though only one figure stood there. By 1900, the valley was nearly empty. The railroad had cut a new line east, leaving Silver Hollow forgotten. Yet the cabin still stood. The lamp still burned. That spring, a young cowpoke named Tom Avery drifted into the area looking for work. Locals warned him not to ride north after sundown, but curiosity got the better of him. He followed the trail until he reached the ridge. The moon was high, washing the valley in pale light. He saw her then, taller than any man, her hair silver, her dress white with dust. She was staring at the horizon, utterly still. Tom called out, but the wind swallowed his voice. He dismounted and stepped closer, his boots sinking into soft earth. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you all right?" No answer. Only the whisper of the river and the hum of crickets. He took another step and realized the truth. She wasn't breathing. Her skin gleamed faintly under the moon, hard as polished stone. He stumbled back, heart hammering. But then thunder cracked overhead, and in the flash of light he saw something on the far ridge, a figure on horseback, small and lean, riding straight toward her. For an instant, Tom thought it was Samuel himself come home through time. Then both shapes vanished in the rain. By morning the statue was gone. In its place lay two sets of footprints leading into the river, ending where the water deepened. The people of Silver Hollow returned for a time, drawn by the tale. Some said she'd turned to stone and shattered when her husband's spirit found her. Others believed the mountains finally called her home. But a few old souls swore that when the moon rises full and the storm winds blow, you can still see them dancing together in the mist, tiny and tall, human and giant, side by side beneath the endless western sky. And so the legend lived on. Travelers crossing that country say the air there feels different. Heavy, electric, full of something waiting. The ridge still stands, the cabin long fallen, but every now and then a lantern flickers in the dark. If you stand quietly enough, you might hear her voice carried by the wind, soft as rain on dry earth. "You came back, my love. I told them I would wait. The thunder answers, deep and warm, rolling across the plain like laughter. Some say it's only weather. Others know better. Out here in the Old West, promises never truly die. They just echo through the ages, whispered on the breath of the storm. The desert wind never forgets. It carries stories like sand, smooths them, shapes them, hides them until someone's heart is ready to listen again. And so it was that half a century after Edda Mae vanished from Silver Hollow, her story began to stir once more. By 1953, the world had changed. The West was paved over, the towns electric, the old trails swallowed by highways. But even in that new age of chrome and noise, there were corners where the past still breathed. One of those was Silver Hollow, though it existed now only as a name on forgotten maps. That spring, a young man named Henry Collins drove west with a broken camera and a head full of dreams. He was a photojournalist from Chicago, chasing what he called the dying ghosts of the old frontier. He'd heard a story in a Tucson bar from an old drifter who swore he'd seen a statue that once was a woman, a giant bride who turned to stone waiting for her husband. Henry laughed it off at first, but the drifter's words stuck like burrs. "She's still there," the man had said, eyes gone glassy. "Standing by the river, taller than a man should be. Some nights you'll see her move when the thunder rolls." Henry drove 300 miles north before the road ended in scrubland and silence. The sun burned low, orange and wide. He followed what might have once been a wagon trail until his tires found only sand. Then under that endless sky he saw the valley, dry, wind-scoured, beautiful in its emptiness. At the far edge, half buried in earth, stood a crumbled cabin. The roof had fallen, the chimney split in two, but there was still a doorway framed by time. He took a photograph and then another, dust swirling through the lens. Something about the air felt wrong, thick with memory. He could almost hear humming low and far away. That night he camped beside the ruins. The stars came out sharp and silver. The wind whispered through the brush, like someone walking just out of sight. And sometime near midnight he heard it, the faintest sound of laughter, warm and soft, like a woman greeting an old friend. He rose, flashlight trembling in hand, and swept the beam toward the ridge. For just an instant he saw her, a woman, impossibly tall, her figure outlined in moonlight. Her hair streamed like smoke, her dress shimmered white. She stood facing the horizon, as if waiting for something only she could see. Henry called out before he realized he'd done it. "Ma'am?" The word tore through the quiet. The woman turned slowly, and the light caught her eyes. Not stone, not flesh, but something in between. She raised a hand, and the wind kicked up so hard it blew the flashlight from his grasp. When he blinked, she was gone. The next morning he found footprints near the ridge, deep. Round impressions twice the length of his boots. They led to the riverbed and stopped where the sand turned wet. He followed them until the water rose over his ankles, then knees, and there he saw it, a faint shimmer beneath the surface, like light bending around something not meant to be seen. Henry left Silver Hollow before sunset, but the valley followed him. Every photo he'd taken came out warped, the negatives streaked with light and shadow that looked almost like faces. He tried to show them to his editor, but the man only laughed. "Son, you've been out in the desert too long." Still, Henry kept one picture for himself, a faint outline on a ridge caught between earth and sky. Sometimes, when the rain hit the glass of his apartment window just right, he swore he could hear that same soft humming again. Decades later, when Henry was an old man, he told his granddaughter the story. He made her promise never to forget. Her name was Lila, and she kept that promise better than he ever imagined. By 1998, Lila Collins was a filmmaker working on a documentary called Ghosts of the American West. When she found her grandfather's photograph, yellowed and cracked, she decided to finish what he'd started. She drove to New Mexico, then followed faded directions scrawled on the back of the picture. What she found was less a valley and more a memory. Dry riverbeds, thorn bushes, and a ridge where the ground seemed to hum beneath her feet. She set up her camera and began to film. "They called her Edda Mae Hart," she said into the recorder, her voice steady. "The giant bride who waited years for her husband's return. Some say she turned to stone. Others say she still waits. Tonight I'll find out which is true." As dusk bled into night, the sky turned bruised purple. Lightning flickered far off over the mountains. Leela panned her camera toward the ridge, and there it was. A faint human shape against the horizon, tall and unmoving. Her pulse jumped. She zoomed in, heart pounding, and the figure seemed to turn, as though sensing her gaze. "Is someone there?" Leela called out, the words thin in the wind. No answer. Just the slow roll of thunder. She kept filming until the batteries died, then sat in the dark, the air alive around her. She could smell rain coming, heavy and wild. And then a voice, not loud but near enough to touch. "You came back, my love." Leela froze. The voice was deep, old, layered like the wind through canyon walls. She lifted the camera again, desperate to catch something, anything. Lightning split the sky, and for one heartbeat she saw them both, a woman towering like the mountain, and beside her a man small but bright as flame. And in hers, then darkness swallowed them. The storm broke. Rain hammered the valley. When it passed, the ridge was empty again. No figures, no footprints, only the shimmer of water sliding down stone. Leela packed her equipment in silence. She didn't sleep that night. Back in Los Angeles, she reviewed the footage frame by frame. For the most part, it was static wind and shadows. But at the final moment, when lightning flashed, a shape appeared, two silhouettes holding hands, the edges glowing faintly blue. In the distance, what might have been a cabin stood whole again, its windows full of firelight. The footage went viral, almost by accident. Viewers argued whether it was real or staged. Paranormal groups claimed proof of eternal love. Skeptics called it clever editing. Leela said nothing. She released the documentary under one title only, Whisper of the Past. Months later, she returned to the valley one last time. The land was quiet, the air heavy with summer heat. She walked to where she'd seen them and laid two flowers in the sand, one wild rose, one desert lily. "I think you found each other," she whispered, "and maybe that's all anyone really needs." As she turned to leave, she thought she heard faint music, a waltz carried on the wind. The clouds gathered over the ridge, not dark but silver, and the ground seemed to tremble once, like the valley itself exhaling. Leela looked back and saw the impossible. The cabin stood whole again. Its windows glowed softly, and by the doorway, two figures swayed in slow rhythm, dancing beneath the stormlight. The man's hand rested on the giant woman's waist. Her head bent low to meet his. The music rose, then faded into thunder. When she blinked, it was gone. Years passed, and Silver Hollow vanished once more beneath time and dust. But Leila's film endured, traveling the world as one of the most haunting love stories ever told. People who watched it swore that something changed inside them, as if the story stirred an ache they'd forgotten. Scientists dismissed the footage, calling it optical weather distortion, but those who believed said otherwise. They claimed the valley still hums with energy, that Edda and Samuel's souls became part of the land, forever circling each other like wind and stone. Even now, truckers who drive Route 62 at night sometimes report strange lights over the old plain. A few say they saw a woman's shape reflected in their mirrors, tall, graceful, walking alongside their rigs for miles before vanishing into the dark. And every so often, when storms sweep in from the east, lightning strikes the same ridge again and again. As if called by name, there are no towns left on the map. The river dried decades ago, but those who wander far enough, who stand quietly enough, can still hear it, a faint hum rising through the earth, steady as a heartbeat, the sound of a promise kept, the sound of love that outlasted the world. They say the desert doesn't keep secrets, that everything left under the sun turns to dust. But maybe that isn't true. Maybe some stories don't fade because they're not made of flesh or bone, but of something older, stronger, something that remembers. And when the thunder rolls, When the wind sweeps across Silver Hollow, the valley whispers again, carrying the same words it's held for more than a century. You came back, my love. I told them I would wait. Somewhere deep beneath the sand, the ground hums in reply, two heartbeats echoing in time, one vast, one small, bound forever in the song of the western sky. Out there, where the world forgets itself, the giant bride still dances with her cowboy, not in flesh, not in stone, but in the wind that never stops moving, and in every storm that remembers how love endures beyond the years.